It's October 1954. A family of four sits on a mohair sofa in Cincinnati, watching Dragnet on a new RCA Victor. On their laps, compartmentalized aluminum trays. On those trays, a hot meal they didn't cook. This, right here, is the moment American dinner broke. Not broke as in failed. Broke as in shattered open. Broke as in departed from everything the previous 300 years of American eating had taught. The mother of that family, 32 years old, had grown up watching her own mother stand at a coal-fed stove in a kerchief, peeling potatoes from 6 in the morning until supper. The father, a returning Korea vet only months back from Busan, remembered his grandmother kneading bread dough the color of wet sand on a floured oak board. And yet, here they were, in a tract house on a cul-de-sac that hadn't existed 4 years earlier, eating turkey and cornbread, dressing and peas and sweet potato whip out of an aluminum tray printed with the Swanson logo. There was a soft hiss as the father peeled the foil seal back from his tray, and a little cloud of steam curled up toward the blue-white glow of the 21-inch picture tube. The children's TV tray legs clicked as they locked into place with a small metallic snap that would become, for an entire generation, the sound of dinner itself. Nobody said grace. Nobody passed a dish. Nobody sat at the dining table in the next room, the one the mother had spent 2 months' worth of her husband's construction foreman paychecks furnishing. That table, polished walnut, would sit untouched almost every weeknight for the next 20 years. This is the story of why. Not a story about a frozen meal, a story about a year that rearranged how a nation fed itself, and through that rearrangement, rearranged what a nation was. To understand 1954, you first have to understand what it was not. It was not 1945. In 1945, meat was still rationed. Butter was still rationed. Sugar came in a blue stamp booklet, and a woman in Des Moines had to plan her Sunday roast around coupon points, the way a general plans a campaign around supply lines. In 1945, the American kitchen was a place of scarcity, ingenuity, and careful drudgery. You made do. You stretched. You reused bacon grease in a coffee can by the stove for 8 months because throwing fat away was morally suspect. By 1950, rationing was gone, but the old rhythms hadn't left yet. A woman in that year still spent, on average, more than 5 hours a day preparing and cleaning up from food. 5 hours. That is a workday by itself, every single day, before any laundry, any childcare, any of the other unpaid labor that held a household together. Dinner was an event that began after breakfast and didn't end until the last dish was dried and shelved at 9 at night. Then came the boom. And the boom wasn't one thing. It was a dozen things crashing into each other at the same traffic intersection, and 1954 was the year they all hit. Start with the houses. Between 1946 and 1954, American builders put up almost 13 million new single-family homes, most of them in the great green ring of suburbs that was metastasizing outward from every major city. A returning vet could get a GI Bill loan with no money down and walk into a Levittown-style 3-bedroom, 1-bath, kitchen-of-the-future home for $58 a month. The kitchens in those houses were something new on the planet. Steel cabinets, Formica countertops the color of pistachio ice cream, refrigerators with actual freezers in them, not just the tiny ice cube trough of the pre-war era, but real freezers, 18 cubic feet or more, big enough to store a month of meat. Stop. Listen to that word. Freezers. Because nothing that happened in 1954 makes sense without the freezer. and the freezer in 1954 had just crossed a line. In 1948, only about a quarter of American homes had a freezer compartment worth the name. By 1954, that number was above 60% and climbing. The household freezer was the single piece of infrastructure that made the Swanson TV dinner possible, made the frozen peas possible, made the frozen orange juice concentrate possible, made the entire frozen food aisle possible. Without the freezer in the suburban kitchen, none of what we're about to describe exists. With it, American dinner was suddenly a problem whose solution could be stored. Now add the television. In 1950, only about 9% of American households owned a television set. That is a vanishingly small slice of the country. 9 out of 10 American families at mid-century still gathered around a radio the same way their grandparents had gathered around a piano. By 1954, that number had leapt to 56%. In 4 years, television went from a curiosity to a majority technology, and the rate of adoption was faster than any consumer technology in history. Up to that point, faster than the automobile, faster than the telephone, faster than electricity itself in many rural regions. 56%, more than half the country on any given night, was now looking at the same blue-white rectangle, watching Lucille Ball, watching Jack Webb in a narrow tie say, "Just the facts, ma'am," watching Ed Sullivan, watching Edward R. Murrow in March of that year take apart Senator Joseph McCarthy on See It Now and change the course of American politics with a broadcast that was watched while millions of families ate dinner. Dinner and news and entertainment had never, in human history, occupied the same room at the same time. Now they did, and something had to give. What gave was the dining table. The pivotal figure in the story of 1954, American dinner, is a man named Jerry Thomas. Thomas was a salesman for the Swanson Company, a Nebraska-based poultry processor that had made its fortune supplying frozen chickens and turkeys to the armed forces during World War II. After the war, Swanson faced a catastrophe, a very American kind of catastrophe. They had too much turkey. In 1953, the company famously found itself with 260,000 pounds of surplus frozen turkey sitting in 10 refrigerated boxcars, riding the rails back and forth across the country because there was nowhere to unload them. The turkey was, technically, spoiling on wheels. Jerry Thomas, the legend goes, saw the compartmentalized aluminum trays that Pan American Airways used to serve in-flight meals on long-haul Boeing Stratocruiser routes. He did the math on a napkin, a 3-compartment tray, turkey in the big one, cornbread, dressing, and gravy in the next, peas and buttered sweet potatoes in the smallest. Freeze the whole thing. Sell it in a box designed, quite deliberately, to look like a television set, complete with wood grain printing and channel-style dials on the outer carton. The first ones launched in very late 1953, but 1954 was the first full sales year, and in that year, Swanson sold more than 10 million units. 10 million. Pause on that number. 10 million frozen turkey dinners in a country of fewer than 50 million households. That means, statistically, that in 1954, roughly 1 in every 5 American families ate at least one Swanson TV dinner. For many of those families, it was the first time in their entire lineage, going back to whenever their ancestors stepped off a boat, that the evening meal had been prepared by someone they had never met, in a city they had never visited, and eaten from a container they would throw in the trash. The Swansons, the Clark brother, and the Gilbert brother who ran the company, became wealthy in a way that the poultry business had never produced before. But more importantly, they proved a thesis. The thesis was this: American women did not want to cook dinner anymore. Not every night. Not the way their mothers had. And American men, returning from Korea or from the factories of the war economy, were willing to pay for that. Here's a detail most people miss. The Swanson TV dinner was not, in 1954, a convenience food for poor households. It was the opposite, at 98 cents a tray adjusted. For inflation, a TV dinner cost roughly what a sit-down meal at a modest diner cost. It was, in 1954, a luxury-adjacent product, a modern product, a product that said we can afford not to cook. It said we have a television. It said we have a freezer. It said we are living in the future, and the future is being served to us, steaming on aluminum. Listen to a kitchen in that year, a Formica table, a percolator burbling coffee, the low hum of a General Electric refrigerator that had been delivered in a truck 2 weeks earlier, the snap of a cardboard sleeve being torn open, the scrape of an aluminum tray being slid into a preheated oven set to 425 degrees, the tick of a mechanical kitchen timer in the shape of a tomato. And, from the living room, the theme music of a new Western, because Westerns, in 1954, were the #1 programming category on American television. Gunsmoke would debut in 1955, but its ancestors, Hop-Along Cassidy and The Lone Ranger and The Gene Autry Show, were already teaching. An entire generation of children that dinner happened in front of cowboys. But 1954 was not only Swanson. It would be a mistake, a flattening mistake, to tell this story as one product and 1 year. The truth is that 1954 was a confluence, a dozen different companies, a dozen different technologies, a dozen different cultural pressures, all arriving at the same kitchen door at the same moment. Consider Minute Rice. General Foods had been experimenting since the late 40s with a parboiled, quick-cooking rice that could be ready in 5 minutes instead of the traditional 40. In the early 50s, they nationally rolled out Minute Rice with an advertising budget that dwarfed anything the rice category had ever seen. And by 1954, it was in roughly 40% of American pantries. Think about what that meant. Rice, a grain that had been cooked the same way on every continent for a minimum of 4,000 years, was, in a single generation, replaced in the American home by a reformulated industrial product that required almost no attention. The old rice, the rice of patience, vanished from suburban cooking in less than a decade. Consider Lipton Onion Soup Mix. Lipton launched it in 1954, a shelf-stable envelope of dehydrated onion flakes, beef stock powder, and monosodium glutamate, intended originally as a shortcut for soup. Within 4 years, some anonymous genius in a kitchen in Southern California would mix the envelope with a pint of sour cream and invent what became the California dip, which would in turn become the single most served party food in the United States for the next 20 years. But the launch, the quiet launch in 1954, is where the line begins. A packet of dust on a shelf in a grocery store was now the engine of American entertaining. Consider Betty Crocker Cake Mix. The Washburn-Crosby Company, which had become General Mills, had launched the first Betty Crocker cake mixes in the late 40s, and by 1954, cake mix sales were accelerating past fresh-baked from-scratch cakes in many urban markets for the first time. A figure named J. William White, an executive at Pillsbury, was watching those numbers with the kind of intensity a general watches troop movements, and he was pushing his own company to match and exceed. The Pillsbury Bake Off, which had launched in 1949, was by 1954 a national television event with a $50,000 grand prize, a sum equivalent to more than $500,000 today. A grandmother from Rockford, Illinois, could become famous for a recipe that called for, as its first ingredient, a box. Pause again. Think about that cultural shift. For most of human history, the measure of a cook was her ability to start from nothing. Flour, water, yeast, time. By 1954, the measure of an American cook was her ability to start from a box and make it look like she had started from nothing. The entire definition of skill had inverted inside a single generation. Now pull back, the way a camera pulls back in a CinemaScope Western, and look at the landscape. In 1954, the country was threaded with new asphalt. The interstate highway system would not be formally authorized by President Eisenhower until 1956, but the debates were raging in Congress in 1954, and the earliest stretches of modern four-lane limited-access highway were already carving through Pennsylvania and Ohio and California. Those roads meant trucks. Trucks meant cold chain distribution. Cold chain distribution meant frozen food could now reach a grocery store in Tulsa or Tucson within 72 hours of leaving the factory in Omaha or Minneapolis. The geography of food had collapsed. Northgate, the first enclosed adjacent shopping center in the modern sense, had opened in Seattle in 1950. By 1954, the model was being studied by architects and developers across the country. Victor Gruen, the Austrian-born architect who would design Southdale in Edina, Minnesota in 1956, was in 1954 drawing up the plans. The mall, as a uniquely American civic form, was gestating, and inside every plan for every mall was an idea that would remake eating even further. The food court was not yet born, but the supermarket anchor was. And the supermarket was changing from a grocery into a food factory. Aisles devoted to cake mix, aisles devoted to frozen meals, an entire wall of glass-fronted freezer cases. No one in 1920 could have imagined such a building. By 1954, it was becoming normal. Meanwhile, a former milkshake machine salesman named Raymond Kroc was driving to San Bernardino, California, in 1954 to meet two brothers named McDonald, who had built a hamburger stand with an assembly line kitchen. Kroc would not open his first franchised McDonald's until 1955, but 1954 was the year of the pilgrimage, the year the decision was made, the year the handshake happened. The entire fast food industry, as we know it today, was conceived in that single visit. And it was conceived because Kroc had watched, with a salesman's eye, what was already happening in American kitchens. Women did not want to cook. Families wanted speed. A hamburger, a bag of fries, a paper cup of Coca-Cola served in 30 seconds on a highway exit was the logical next step after the Swanson TV dinner on the mohair sofa. Kroc was not inventing a new culture. He was catching a wave that had already broken. And across the country, a Memphis businessman named Kemmons Wilson, who had founded the first Holiday Inn in 1952 after a miserable family road trip through a country with no reliable mid-range motels, was, by 1954, opening his fourth location and beginning to franchise. The whole post-war infrastructure of mobility, Holiday Inns and Howard Johnson's and interstate rest stops and drive-in restaurants, was assembling itself in exactly this window. A family in 1954 could, for the first time, plan a vacation in which no meal of the entire trip was cooked by anyone the family knew. Soundscape check. The clink of a TV tray leg locking. The tinny tune of a transistor radio, a new device in 1954, playing Rosemary Clooney's Hey There in the kitchen. The pop and hiss of an electric percolator. The whoosh of a new hot point oven closing on a pair of frozen aluminum trays. The jingle of a local milkman's truck, because the milkman was still a presence in 1954, though his days were numbered. The low conversational laughter of a laugh track on a sitcom. And over all of it, the saltiness of commercially prepared mashed potatoes rehydrated from a powder. A taste that by 1954 was, for millions of American children, simply what mashed potatoes tasted like. The peak of this era would come later. Through the late 50s and into the 60s, frozen food would double, then double again. By 1960, the average American household was eating frozen food at least 3 nights a week. Green Giant would expand. Birdseye would expand. Stouffer's, which had been a Cleveland restaurant family, would pivot into the frozen meal business and eventually surpass Swanson. The Swansons themselves, Clark and Gilbert, would sell the company to Campbell Soup in 1955 for a sum that made them among the wealthiest men in Nebraska history. Mrs. Butterworth's would launch in 1958. Chicken of the Sea would push tuna casserole to the center of the American dinner table with a national ad campaign that 1954 was just beginning to fund. And then, because every peak has a shift, the shift came. In the late 60s, a generation of children who had been raised on TV dinners began to ask, quietly at first and then loudly, what exactly was in them. Sodium levels in a single Swanson tray by 1970 were routinely above 2,000 milligrams, more than an adult's entire recommended daily intake. The aluminum itself, which was fine for oven heat, but increasingly in the 70s and 80s, became the suspected vector for all sorts of health anxieties, began to be replaced with plastic microwave safe trays in the early 80s. The microwave, which became a mass consumer product after 1975, would eventually kill the oven-heated TV dinner in its original form entirely. By 1986, Swanson's wood grain boxes were being redesigned for microwave preparation. And the specific ritual of slipping a foil-covered aluminum tray into a preheated oven and waiting 45 minutes for dinner to emerge, quietly ended. But the deeper shift was cultural. By the late 1980s, a woman named Leona Helmsley, the New York hotelier, was famously quoted as saying, "Only the little people cooked anymore," a cruel line that nonetheless captured something true about a certain class of American ambition. Dinner, in the upper-middle-class imagination of the Reagan years, had become a signifier. Cooking from scratch was rediscovered, fetishized, taught on PBS by Julia Child reruns and on the new Food Network after 1993. What had been the default in 1945 became, by 1995, a luxury and a hobby. The Swanson dinner had inverted everything so thoroughly that cooking itself was now the exotic act. Yet the infrastructure that 1954 built never left. It only rebranded. The modern meal kit, Blue Apron, HelloFresh, Factor, the entire direct-to-consumer prepared food economy of the 2020s, is the direct lineal descendant of the Swanson aluminum tray. The only difference is that the tray is now made of recycled cardboard. The meal is now labeled organic or keto or low FODMAP, and the company selling it posts on Instagram. The underlying promise, "We will deliver a hot meal to your family that you did not, in any meaningful sense, cook," is the exact promise Jerry Thomas made in 1954. The marketing language has changed. The deal has not. The frozen food aisle, too, is the 1954 inheritance. Every lean cuisine, every Amy's, every Stouffer's lasagna, every Trader Joe's Mandarin orange chicken is sitting in a freezer case whose basic design and logic was worked out by Birdseye and Swanson and Green Giant between roughly 1948 and 1956. The specific brands rotate, the case itself does not. Even the way we eat, the physical posture of American dinner, was set in 1954. Americans, according to every major time use study from 1965 to the present, eat more meals in front of a screen than any other people on Earth. The screen has migrated, of course, from the RCA Victor in the living room to the kitchen TV in the 80s, to the laptop at the kitchen counter in the 2000s, to the iPhone propped against the water glass at the restaurant in the 2020s. But the basic geometry, a face, a plate, and a glowing rectangle, all in the same field of vision, is a 1954 invention. It had no precedent in human history before that year. It is now, and has been for 70 years, the norm. There is one more thread to pull, and it runs deeper than any brand or any technology. 1954 was the year American dinner became a choice instead of a duty. That is the real shift, the one underneath all the others. For every century of American history before 1954, dinner was a thing that had to be done by specific people in specific ways, because there was no alternative. The woman cooked because the stove demanded it, because the children demanded it, because the social contract demanded it, because the ingredients themselves, unrefrigerated and untransported, demanded it. There was no opting out. 1954 introduced the opt-out. It said, you can, if you wish, spend 45 minutes in an ovens company instead of 4 hours in a kitchens company, and the outcome on the plate will be, for most purposes, acceptable. You can, if you wish, watch Dragnet while you eat. You can, if you wish, sit on a sofa instead of at a table. You can, if you wish, let the children eat what they want while you eat what you want. None of those sentences could have been spoken in 1934. All of them were being spoken, casually, in kitchens across the United States by the end of 1954. And once a duty becomes a choice, it never, in the long run, goes back to being a duty. That is the iron law of cultural change. Whatever the food critics and the back-to-the-land movement and the farm-to-table restaurants and the organic homesteaders of the 2020s might wish, the decision made on that mohair sofa in October 1954 has not been, and will not be, unmade. Dinner is now, and will remain, optional. Which brings us back to the family in the Cincinnati living room. The father is 34. He's going to die in 1981 of a heart attack at 59, a statistic in a generation that ate more sodium and more saturated fat and more processed meat than any cohort in recorded history. The mother is 32. She's going to live to be 91. And in her final years, in an assisted living apartment in 2013, she will tell her granddaughter that her proudest day was the day she bought her first freezer. The two children, 6 and 9, in that October of 1954, will grow up to be a commercial airline pilot and a school teacher, and both of them, independently, will tell their own children that the taste of turkey and gravy from an aluminum tray is still, against all evidence, the taste of home. They didn't know. That night in 1954, with Dragnet flickering and the foil hissing and the TV tray legs clicking, they didn't know they were pioneers. They thought they were just having dinner, a little modern, a little fun, a little of a treat. They thought the walnut table in the next room would still get used most nights. They thought this was a novelty. They were wrong about the novelty. They were right about almost everything else that mattered. Every dinner decision we make, 70 years later, traces back to them. Every meal kit, every drive-through, every microwave ping, every glowing rectangle propped at the end of a dinner plate, every question a young couple asks each other on a Tuesday night. In 2026, about whether they really feel like cooking, or whether they should just order something, or heat something, or let the app decide. All of it is the long shadow of a family on a mohair sofa, a Nebraska turkey company with too much inventory, and a year, 1954, when the oldest ritual of American life, the evening meal, quietly and permanently changed its mind about what it was for. The mother is gone now. The father is gone. The mohair sofa was hauled to a curb in 1978 and replaced by a sectional in burnt orange. The RCA Victor was taken to a repair shop in 1967 and never picked up. The house in Cincinnati was sold in 1994 and torn down in 2011 to make way for a wider road. Nothing physical from that evening survives. Nothing except the habits. The habits survive. The habits have children of their own now, and grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, multiplying outward across a country that has, in every measurable way, become the country that one October evening predicted it would become. They were the first. We are all still their children.